we're coming up rapidly on 4 years of being open, which is pretty exciting. Green Care does a lot of really exciting things. We do a 21-day Kickstart, which was sort of the purpose of the restaurant. I think we probably have a number of Kickstarters here. We're coming up to 1,000 people that we've had go through the program now, maybe 4 dozen doctors. We're rapidly engaging. I don't know if any of y'all remember Dr. Fred Tennille from the Rest in Town Center, but he's actually invited us to do a partnership, so we're starting to engage with them. And that's been after a number of years of him recommending patients into the Kickstart program, which is pretty cool. And we watch dramatic things happen. It's almost like a miracle a day when you're working here and you see people that make a diet change and diseases go away very, very rapidly. Pain goes away. People get off medication. So it's really dramatic. And I've been very fortunate to work with a great team. My cohort here, Pericles, so we'll give a round for Pericles. And Mike and Denise have been recently working with us and helping. They run, we co-hosted with Mike and his plant-based diet, the first Veg Fest, which we're going to do again April 19th in next 2020. So give a round for Mike. And so we're very fortunate to have a lot of advocates, I think, people that come and help support the mission that we're trying to promote. And we're, let's see, a couple other things that are coming up next Sunday. Dr. Jim Loomis is going to be here, most recently from the Game Changers film. Has anybody seen that?
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
That's actually going to be out on Netflix in a couple of weeks. It's on iTunes now. It's the #1. It's sold more on iTunes than any other film, which is very exciting. And so we're excited about that. We do dinner and a movie once a month. So this coming Wednesday, we're showing a film called Plant Codes. That's pretty new. It's a series of interviews with people that have seen dramatic health turnarounds. And it's got a lot of the usual suspects in there. There's no graphic animal violence. And let's see, at the end of the month, we have our Italian night, which is an all-you-can-eat buffet of pizza that Pericles makes his special burrata cheese and a lot of different concoctions of pizza that is always awesome. So I'm thrilled about that. So tonight is going to be a really fun event. I think we did this a couple months ago, I think with Courtland Milloy, who's from the Washington Post, and Jean Baur. Courtland went through our Kickstart program in January this year, and maybe he can talk just briefly about his experience with plant-based. And then I'm thrilled to have Jean Baur come back, who's a dear friend and has run Farm Sanctuary. He's been doing this for decades and decades, and having a huge impact, I think, on the population, being sort of a role model for a happy vegan and making change in the world. So, sort of without further ado, I'm going to let you guys.
But before we get started, I just want to really quickly give you this award, the Friend of Farm Animals Award from Farm Sanctuary. We were going to do this at the Hoedown this year in August, but we're just very grateful for all you do here to raise awareness, to help people eat plants and heal from preventable diseases. And you inspire so many people and do so much good work that helps all of us, but also animals in the earth. So wanted to give you that. Friend of Farm Animals.
Let's see, how do you turn the mic on? Is the thing down here? Oh, there we go.
It's on.
Yes. Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, I'm Courtland Milloy, write for the Washington Post, and 9.5 months ago, I started the Kickstart program and have been plant-based ever since. Thank you. Oh, it gets better. If it takes 9 months to have a baby, a 9-pound baby, I have put out the equivalent of 4 babies of fat. Since then, lost 40 pounds doing this. Yeah, I don't like to brag because fat fights back and end up back again, but it's been wonderful. So with that, I've been writing columns every month about an update on how this is going. I figured that the more people know, the more I'll be incentivized to stick with it. And I wanted to do a follow-up on what has been a problem for me, and I'm hoping Jean can help me with that. And it is the dairy stuff. I like creamy, sweet things, and around this time of year, I've become very susceptible to eggnog. And they seem to be putting it out earlier and earlier. It's on the shelves now. I never knew you did it for Halloween, but apparently it's a Halloween drink now. And I had a visceral reaction when I saw it at the store. I mean, it was like I'd seen, I was a heroin addict and I'd seen a big pile of it there. So I want to write about that. And because so many of the pictures I see of you are accompanied by cows, I thought we'd talk a little bit about dairy stuff. And what is, anybody put cream in coffee? Anybody eat cheese out here? Are you all done with that kind of stuff? Cheese, the dairy, the cream, and the coffee, stuff like that. Sweets? Well,
Half and half is the last
half and
one.
half. Half and half. Oh, okay. Well, help me then. And maybe during the Q&A, you all can share things about that. What's the deal with the dairy, and why is it so hard, and what is to be done?
Yeah, well, there are thankfully now many alternatives to cow's milk that are very creamy and very sweet, and that's good from a standpoint of having access, not necessarily so good from a health standpoint, right? Because it's still got sugar and things are not great for us. But the dairy industry is one of the most entrenched, most powerful industries in Washington, D.C. They get billions of dollars every year in various forms of subsidies. And, the different administrations, while some may be more progressive and do some positive things, like with Obama, for example, he did, they had the White House Organic Garden and, talked about farmers markets and did some really positive things, more symbolically. But still, you have the former USDA secretary under Obama, Tom Vilsack, who now represents the Dairy Export Federation, to promote dairy exports, because we're producing so much in this country that we're not consuming it all. So now there's all this effort to, ship it around the world. So it's very entrenched. Kids in schools are giving cow's milk. We come to normalize this as this is what we need for calcium, which is one of these myths many of us grew up with. You need cow's milk for calcium. Then there's also, some folks talking about how it can be addictive, that there's actually addictive properties in it. And I'm not a doctor, haven't really gotten deep on this, but, somebody explained to me that, like with a kid, a baby who is nursing, that there needs to be a real attraction to nurse. There's a subtle urge, it's a natural instinct, but then also like kind of an addictive property in the milk to continue to get the baby to suckle. So, and it's been said that cow's milk might have this addictive property. Now, again, I don't know the details, but this is what I've heard about it. When it comes to how cows are treated, this is something I know a lot about. I actually went to Cornell, studied agricultural economics, and actually studied the dairy industry in upstate New York. And we've rescued many cows from the dairy industry. For a cow to give milk, she has to have a baby. They don't lactate just for the heck of it. They lactate to feed their baby. And then on dairy farms, the baby is taken away, sometimes within minutes, sometimes within a day or two, and then raised separately so that the milk can be taken and sold for human consumption. And the mother is hooked up to milk machines 2 or 3 times a day. They produce about 10 times more milk than they would produce in nature. So their bodies are under intense stress. I remember reading industry journals talking about how for a dairy cow, it's like running a marathon every day. So they're pushed very hard. And they only last in production about 3 years because they're pushed so hard. And then they're killed young and slaughtered usually for beef, or always for beef, usually for ground beef. So it's an industry that, oftentimes people who care about animals go vegetarian because they don't want to harm animals, which is great. But the dairy industry in some ways is actually worse than the meat industry, because you have cows who are continuously impregnated, their babies continuously taken away, which is also very emotionally stressful for both the mother and the baby. Then you have the mother that's pushed to her biological limit. And then one of our big campaigns at Farm Sanctuary for years was to prevent downed animals too sick to walk, from being dragged onto slaughterhouse trucks and taken to slaughter. Most of those downed animals were dairy cows because they were pushed so hard they became downed animals. So it's an industry that has this patina of milk, and they have all these slogans. It does a body good. Although I think they were actually prevented from saying that because it doesn't do a body good. And for many people who are lactose intolerant, it's harmful. And still, it's being pushed on kids in schools. It's just wrong in so many ways. Bad for animals, bad for citizens, and tax money is going into it in a huge way, which is just so wrong.
I had an uncle who was a large animal veterinarian working outside of Wichita, Kansas. This is during the 50s and 60s, and it was interesting because this was a part of the state that they actually did want black people living in this town, and were very vocal about it. But the veterinarian who worked there left, and my uncle was the only one who would come. And talk about something trumping race. If you could take care of somebody's cow, you became the king of the place. And I would go around with him to the various farms, and people greeted him like he was royalty. And we'd go out to the barn, and this was my first experience outside of cat and dog world. These are huge creatures, but people loved their cows on these small farms the way they would a pet. They had names for them. They had custom-made bells for them, and they love these animals. When you wrote this piece in June for the Washington Post, it's very provocative. I hope you go back and see it. It's a critique of the dairy industry and why these farmers should transfer to other means of operation. There was a letter that reminded me of the Wichita story, and that was from the guys who had the small farms. And they were saying, we love our cows. We don't mistreat them. Their milk, they don't use machines. As one of the people that in Wichita, they said, "Come, let me show you how to milk a cow. Put your hand on it," and I couldn't. You grab that udder. No. But that's what they did. And they said, this is the product that clothes our children, gives them school supplies, medical supplies. What do you tell people like that? They're still around.
Yeah, no, it's hard because it's a livelihood. It's sort of like tobacco farmers, right? And when at a certain point people stop consuming this product, and when government policies, prevent advertising for tobacco, then you have family farms and large farms and livelihoods that feel threatened. And in the case of the dairy industry, you have some smaller farms who are more traditional and have a relationship with the cows that's, I would say, better, but still not necessarily good, because the babies are still taken away no matter, how big the farm is. But there's a more of a sensitivity there. But those smaller farms are increasingly being pushed out by these big farms. And we have a glut of over 1 billion pounds of government cheese in storage. And still, we're getting government money that's going to the big farms and the little farms. Now, I don't know if anybody saw the recent article about Sonny Perdue, the USDA secretary. He was in Wisconsin talking at the Dairy Expo. And he said, small farms, you guys, you're out of luck because you're not going to stay in business long. And he was very kind of dismissive of it. And, this is an old story of USDA, get big or get out. That's been kind of the trend in agriculture. And so, but my feeling is that these are small farms who are not necessarily, I'm not anti-farmer, I'm anti-cruelty. And the idea is to try to create opportunities for farmers to live well and to produce something that people want, and to do it in a way that is non-exploitive as much as possible. So for dairy farmers, one of the things that I think would make a lot of sense, especially for these small farmers who are struggling and, frankly, are going to probably not be able to stay in business for many, many more years, instead of giving them money to produce more milk, which the government is currently doing, take some of that money and start working on programs to transition, to help these farmers learn new skills, new opportunities. And there's a need for more fruits and vegetables, so growing those kinds of crops, but then also different kinds of grains. And I sometimes sort of fantasize about, like quinoa and amaranth were like these newly discovered grains, ancient grains. There's all kinds of other stuff, that could be rediscovered. Like cherimoyas, it's like a fruit, that we've not ever heard of, or pawpaws, which is a fruit. So there's these different plants and trees that we could be rediscovering, or even variations of like apples that are, maybe don't have as long of a shelf life, but would really appeal to a more local, like farm to table kind of activity. And so with dairy farms, I would love to see some of these small dairy farms transition. Some could actually even become sanctuaries, and then even do some hospitality stuff. In addition to producing food, they could create experiences, a pumpkin patch, around Halloween, or, at our farm every year for Thanksgiving, we do a celebration for the turkeys, where they're the guests of honor, and people come and feed the turkeys and eat vegan food. So these are the kinds of experiences I think many people want, or a corn maze, so you can do these sorts of things on a farm that had been a dairy farm. And I think that if there were incentives and encouragements for these dairy farmers to start looking for, and supports, to start looking for new opportunities, I think it'd be a very good thing for the farmers, for animals, for consumers. And it would also help connect consumers more closely to the source of their food, which is, I think, one of the huge problems with our food system today is we're so disconnected. And we're spending money and supporting systems that we say, I don't want to hear about it because it's so upsetting. So I think really getting more immersed, more connected to our food, and having government programs that encourage that and empower farmers to grow for the future instead of holding on to the dairy industry, which is something that is I think, it's not something that we need more of, and in fact much less of.
You mentioned in this piece that that milk consumption is declining, and we all know that there's a movement towards more vegan food choices, Impossible burgers and things like that. What do you think of this change, and why do you think it's coming about now?
Well, I think that I'm really happy about this change, that there's so many alternatives to animal products. I think that in recent years, with, for example, Beyond Meat going on the New York Stock Exchange and, opened at $25 a share, and within a couple weeks it was over $100 a share, that got the attention of a lot of animal ag folks, and they started recognizing that, this other thing's got wheels. We need to start thinking more about how to get on top of this and involved with this process. So I think money talks, and as consumers start voting with their dollars, as we have been doing, to support more plant-based foods, businesses are starting to respond. But I think it's not always the healthy food. Like we were talking a little bit earlier about eggnog. The Silk makes an amazing eggnog. Right? It's vegan, but right. So these are and I would say the same about Beyond Meat, the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Whopper or the Impossible Burger. That these things are much better for animals, right? Because you don't have animals that are being slaughtered. They're much better for the environment because they use far fewer resources to raise animals for food. You need to grow tons and tons of corn, tons and tons of soy. You use a lot of grazing land. 10 times more land in the US is used for animal agriculture as opposed to plant-based agriculture. And with the global meat industry, we're going to places like the Amazon to graze animals and to grow soybeans to feed livestock. So this is a very inefficient industry. So going towards plant burgers instead of meat burgers is a plus from that standpoint. From a health standpoint, I would say that their plant-based burgers are less bad than meat burgers, but not necessarily healthy. And the same thing with different types of plant-based milks. And there's a wide variety. Some have a lot of sugar in them. And some are fairly processed with oils too. So I think not all plant-based milks are the same. Some are much healthier than others. But the fact that there's this massive move on the part of consumers and also now on the part of industry, businesses, and investors in that space is very exciting. And but one of the sort of challenges now is in the U.S., our meat consumption has been relatively stable. The drinking of cow's milk has been dropping. They're now turning the cow's milk into cheese because you can use a lot more milk to make a pound of cheese than a pound of milk, right? So then they start consolidating into a new product, and it's just predicated on overproduction. So that's another thing that's been happening. And then the export markets, like in China and India, as those countries have become wealthier, they're eating more meat, and so U.S. businesses are very much connected with international markets. So that's another concern.
Let's go back to your roots for a minute. Did you really start by selling veggie dogs from a VW van at Grateful Dead concerts?
Sure did, yeah. That's right. That's how we started back in '86. Yeah.
86.
Yeah.
How did what started you on that path?
Well, I grew up in a very conservative Catholic family in Hollywood, California, of all places, and I was up in the hills and I saw beautiful oak trees being cut down so houses can be made bigger. And as a kid, it just kind of viscerally bothered me. And I saw deer being hit by cars in the neighborhood, and I remember a deer that was trapped in a neighbor's backyard, tangled in a chain link fence. And I just saw the harms people were causing to other animals and to the earth. And then, of course, the Vietnam War was on TV. I was born in '62, so that was going on. I'm thinking, what are we doing, right? And I just didn't really want to be a cog in a system causing so much harm. So that was the initial beginning. And then in high school and college, I started volunteering with human rights groups, with environmental groups, and hanging out with activists. I learned about factory farming and just how inefficient it is, how we could feed more people with fewer resources by eating plants instead of animals. Then I learned about the cruelty of factory farming. My grandmother first told me about how veal calves are raised. That was the first inclination I had there. Then also one time in high school, I had come home and my mother had made a chicken dinner, and I saw it was a dead bird on his or her back on the plate, right? The legs and wings attached, and I saw that for the first time. It's like, I'm not going to eat that, And so there were like little glimpses here and there. But it was really like in the early 80s when I started getting more involved in activism and learning more about the issues that I realized how significant our food system was and the profound impacts it was having. And then when I learned it was possible to eat plants and live well without causing harm, it made all the sense in the world. So I went vegan in 1985, co-founded Farm Sanctuary in 1986, and funded it by selling these veggie dogs out of our Volkswagen van at Grateful Dead shows. And we used that same van to do investigations of factory farms and stockyards and slaughterhouses. We would go in to document what was happening. We felt that it was important to know what was going on if we were going to work on these issues. And we would find living animals left for dead, and we started rescuing them. And that's how the sanctuary began. And we, at the time, were living in a little row house in Wilmington, Delaware, and with a little backyard. So we brought the animals there, rehabilitated them.
I mean, what kind of animals could you bring in the backyard?
Little ones for the most part, but a sheep or a goat. I remember one time we had this goat, and we were walking in the neighborhood, and we had the goat on a leash, sort of like a dog, and one of the neighbors said, "That's a very interesting looking dog," because it's this whole different context, right? But we had some calves in there, young calves, that we would rescue, but then we would find homes. So our adopt a farm animal started very early in the process. I remember we had this pig, Charlie, who, and it was, again, a row house with a little shed and then a backyard. And at night, we would put Charlie in the shed to sleep, and sometimes he'd be banging on the kitchen door to come inside. We were, what's going on here? He didn't want to go to the bathroom in his bed. He wanted to come into the house. So he'd go, and he'd want to take the stance. We'd put a bucket under him, he'd pee, and then he'd go back out. And the pigs do not like to make their own bed messy, right? So we learned that right away. And so, but yeah, we were there from 86 to about 89. In 87, a tofu farmer in Pennsylvania let us use some of his land. We lived in a school bus on that tofu farm for a couple years. And then we got the farm in upstate New York at the end of 1989, and then moved the animals up in 1990. And in Pennsylvania, we had some space for animals.
So Grandma was wrong to say, your room looks like a pigsty. Let me ask you this. Speaking of my family, yeah, on my mother's side, it's just farmers, and we go to visit, and dinner time, my aunt would bring me out in the yard, but then she'd find a chicken and put the chicken under a little water pipe, put the head under there. Am I grossing you out already? You know? And yank it off, and the chicken would run around like crazy and stuff. She'd boil water, pick the feathers out, do all this stuff. Next thing you know, it's on the plate. For about a year, I could not eat chicken, you know. But that wore off after a while, and then I became almost a Popeyes addict, you know, along with the eggnog. You make these films, these undercover documentaries that show the heart. What did you see, without grossing people out too much, and do those kind of things have an effect on whether people will stop or continue eating those foods?
Yeah, well, you know, I by the way, had a similar experience you did, in terms of like, you have this thing and you say, you have an experience, you witness violence to a chicken or whatever and say, I'm not going to do that. Like, I had that in high school, but then it wore off, right? Because I was not exposed to it routinely, and then everybody around me was eating meat, and it just becomes normal. And you just, you know, as social animals that we are, we tend to do what those around us do, which is why it's so important to try to be around folks that encourage and engage in healthy habits. But the things I saw during those investigative days, and you know, I did it for about 20 years, and I still occasionally do it, but not very much, were, you know, animals in cages where they can't move, you know, confined for months or years at a time. Animals literally on piles of dead animals. Our first rescued animal was a sheep named Hilda, who we found on a pile of dead animals behind Lancaster Stockyards in Pennsylvania. We come up to this dead pile, there's dead sheep, there's dead cows, dead pigs, and this one lamb lifts her head. So we took her home, and she lived with us for more than 10 years. But you know, in egg production, hens are in small cages where they can't even stretch their wings. They live that way for a year or two. Now, there's been, thankfully, in recent years, a lot of efforts to prohibit that type of extreme confinement. There have been several initiatives, including in California, to require these animals at least to have space to stretch their wings, which is very modest.
Is this a free range?
Well, this would be cage. This is for egg production. Be cage-free.
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 Okay.
Cage-free, which is less bad, but I would still say not good, because you still have the animals treated as commodities, raised by the thousands. And you know, when you talk about free range, I went to Joel Salatin's farm in Virginia, and he was one of the guys in Food Inc., sort of the anti-factory farming guy, salt of the earth, you know, small farmer guy. And, you know, his place isn't all that great, honestly. I saw some of his pasture-raised chickens, which sounds good, but he had these chickens in these enclosures on the pasture, and they were, you know, like a 10 by 10 box, basically, of wood with chicken wire. It was only about a foot or two tall, with a metal roof on it. And this was in the summer. And so you have these chickens basically on pasture but confined. And these are birds that are genetically bred to grow like 4 times faster than normal. So their hearts and lungs have a hard time supporting this growth rate. And then you add the heat to that. They're panting, open mouth breathing, which is very distressing. And in some cases, there were dead ones there. And then in this pasture, they had trash cans full of dead birds. And then I went into his pig area, and I saw dead birds. And I thought, here's this local guy is thinking it's a good thing to take these birds that died there and feed them to the pigs. It was, you know, so it was, he didn't really have kind of the animal welfare thing going very much, you know, and some of what he talks about I think is very good. But what's happening now with growing awareness about factory farming and opposition to the extreme cruelty, there are new systems that are being developed that are less bad, but are not necessarily good. And that's kind of the place we're in now. And, part of what's happening too are these ag-gag laws, where agribusiness doesn't want people talking about this, doesn't want people investigating these factory farms, and even some of the not so bad, or the less bad farms. And these ag-gag laws make it illegal to investigate and talk about this stuff.
What works then? What works better than the horror film, which I thought would work a lot better if we saw more of them? But what do you find works?
Well, I think the horror, the ugly films are important. It gets people's attention. It's kind of like a slap in the face and a wake up. But then people need to know, what can I do? And so I think a big way that change happens is to have plant-based food accessible and tasty, like at places like this, where you can come and you can get it, and it's not that hard. When Farm Sanctuary started back in 1986, our sort of thinking was, this is horrible, people will be appalled, they're gonna see these images and they're gonna stop eating meat, right? And some people do that, but most people kind of do what those around them do. And if everybody's eating meat, if that's the norm, I think what I'm feeling now is we need to create a new norm where plant-based food is accessible and it's normal and it's not crazy hippie vegans. Although I am a crazy hippie vegan, but normalizing this stuff I think is really key, and making it accessible and affordable. I think the vegan movement, I sometimes joke about the vegan tax. Sometimes, vegan food can be expensive. Even like the Impossible Whopper, is more expensive than the regular Whopper at Burger King. And part of that has to do with mass, scales of production and the government subsidies for animal agriculture. So part of that is, legitimate there, I think. But in some cases, if you are able to charge $5 for an apple, at a fancy organic store instead of $2 or whatever, you're going to charge the $5. So I think our food system is all upside down right now, where unhealthy food is very accessible and very cheap. And it needs to be that plant-based whole foods are accessible and cheap. And that's where we need to shift to that.
The industry really fights hard. like to play tennis, and I play a lot better now, by the way. I can actually reach the ball sometimes. But during the U.S. Open, the French Open, the African American tennis player Sloane Stevens.
Yeah.
She was doing the chocolate milk thing, and making it seem like the chocolate milk was the thing that made her. They tied into victory and tied into health.
She's the one who got exhausted in the final of the French Open.
Yes. But nobody, you're right. I think they pulled the chocolate milk commercial up to that. But they brought it back on the next one. Very good. So it's at that level that
Absolutely.
And how do you fight the disinformation?
Well, that's what we're up against, right? This disinformation, where the NFL has relationships with the dairy industry, and I was doing triathlons, some years ago. Almost always at the end, you have milk people promoting their stuff. You finish the Ironman, they say, "Here's milk." I said, "No thanks," So they're very entrenched and they're very strategic and smart about it. And again, they're in schools with tax money buying cow's milk to feed to kids, many who are lactose intolerant. It's just like insane, really. But no, it's a system we're up against, and it's entrenched, and there's infrastructure, there's these price supports that enable and promote lots of milk production. Then you have all this milk that has to be stored. And the government puts money into storage. I was in Michigan not long ago. They talked about having to build a couple $100 million for cheese storage. It's crazy the kind of money available for this industry that is so kind of backwards.
Why wouldn't it work to emphasize the fact that human beings are drinking milk that was produced for another species?
I think that's a great argument, and it's one we sometimes make, but I think we need to keep hammering that. I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
This is cow's milk for cows.
Right. And what is in the milk? You mentioned the chickens, and I would imagine the same thing happens with all other things we eat, made to grow faster, You know, we just work and push them to do. What is going into them to make that we're consuming, I guess?
Yeah, well, you know, bovine growth hormone is legal in the U.S. It's not legal in other countries. But, you know, one of the things I think people are very sort of not happy about cow's milk is the somatic cell counts, which are pus cells. And in the U.S., we allow far more than like European countries. And pus cells are an indication of disease. And many, something like 40% of the cows in the U.S. have mastitis, which is a bacterial infection of the udder. So this is now getting into the milk, pus cells.
I was right for not touching it. Right? Good. Okay. And it helps with the eggnog too. That's huh? But okay, this is helpful. I need this. I need the reinforcement. Keep on. Tell me more about what's in this stuff and what it does, what it's doing to us.
Well, there's also like hormones, and in some cases, like in the case of chickens, for example, they're not actually fed hormones. You know, a lot of people believe they're fed hormones, although some of these substances honestly are too complicated for me to tell if it's a hormone or an antibiotic or what. They're given all kinds of things, but in terms of the hormones, chickens, as I mentioned before, have been genetically bred to grow 4 times faster than normal. So they have a lot of growth hormone in their bodies because of their genetic makeup. So that's another thing that is passed along to consumers. So, you have animals who've been manipulated to be a certain way, which has impacts, and then you also have additives and enhancements to their growth that also have implications. And, antibiotics are another one we were talking about earlier. The majority of the antibiotics used in the United States are fed to farm animals. And so this results in the development of antibiotic-resistant pathogens. If you have chickens that are routinely being given, say penicillin or some other kind of thing, the salmonella that the penicillin works on die, but the salmonella that the penicillin doesn't work on survive and reproduce. And that's how these antibiotic-resistant pathogens become such a problem. And then, when a human being is infected and they're given medication to try to prevent this salmonella infection or whatever it might be, the antibiotic doesn't work because these are resistant pathogens that have been kind of created in the system. So it's a system that pharmaceuticals is huge in also, actually. We, years ago, were working on a bill in the state of New Jersey to ban confining calves in veal crates. And we had some success. We got it through the state Senate, and it was going through the state assembly. We went through one of the committees, and then right before it was going to go on the floor of the assembly, it died. And we learned that it was the pharmaceutical people, and New Jersey's a big pharmaceutical state, that ended up killing it. And so this is an industry that is tied to pharmaceuticals, and if you think about it, what would happen if most people in the US started eating a whole foods plant-based diet? Think about the cost, the lost profits for heart medication, right? And I'm not saying that doctors are inherently evil, but when you're profiting from a certain thing, there's an incentive not to look very closely. And then to start creating narratives and stories about how we are here to save the people, we are here to do a good thing. Even farmers say this. They want to feed the world, right? There's these narratives people start developing around what they're doing to enable them to do something that when you really step back and think about it critically and evaluate the reality, the empirical reality, is just completely backwards. So that's part of what happens, and so pharmaceutical people would say, we're trying to save people and prevent disease. And in a superficial way, you can see that argument, but when you step back, it's much bigger. Another example of something that's happening now, greenwashing that we're concerned about, has to do with biogas, which is taking like these waste lagoons at these factory farms where they produce tons and tons of liquid waste. And it's creating methane problems. And so a solution that sadly some environmental people are advocating for is you capture that methane and you turn it into energy. Now, on a superficial level, if you can prevent this methane from going to the air, that's a good thing. But you got to step back and say, why do we have that methane in the first place? And what were the costs of producing it by corn and soy production, which also it creates a lot of greenhouse gases, and then you feed it to animals, and it's again very inefficient. Then you have all this waste. So these manure digesters for biogas is another problem right now, because then if we have, then we create a dependency on animal waste for energy, right? And that's just an example of how systems sort of, one little part leads to another little part, and then pretty soon you have this big mess. Yeah. And that's what we kind of have. And, you know.
Yeah, systems, that is, man, it is really powerful, because ultimately we're talking about a capitalist system with its own built-in incentives. And in your book, the Farm Sanctuary book there, you lay out some things that I guess enlighten people. I don't know if you can ask everybody to do the things, but there are steps that people can take to start working against the system.
Yeah, and one of the things, just don't participate in it, you know, and by eating plants instead of animals, that's voting with our dollars and supporting a better alternative to this messed up animal agriculture system. I think it's also, you know, in a capitalist world like we live in, money is very influential, including in politics. So, but people also have a voice. And so we can vote with our dollars supporting plant-based companies. And there are some positive things happening actually in Washington, D.C. There's now a trade association called the Plant-Based Foods Association that represents plant-based businesses to start battling it out. Now they're up against, you know, they've got like a pea shooter and they're up against like an army with, you know, battleships and stuff. So it's, you know, we're still very young and early in this process, but at least the engagement has started. And the systems are being challenged. And when you have big companies that now start investing in plant-based business, and this is where it's, you know, you have the battleships coming to our side. And I use these references to war because it's, you know, in politics, it's like a battle. And ideally, it'd be nice if it wasn't that. But, you know, when you have those kind of resources coming over to start defending plant-based businesses, that's a step in the right direction, I think.
The big battle for me has been the battle against with myself on this. Nobody is twisting my hand to say you got to eat that or you got to eat that. I know better, you know, I'm not a little kid. But I'll tell you, it seems that there's a disconnect sometimes in what my brain is saying and what my mouth wants to taste. My hand seems to have a mind of its own, and it just wants to grab things. And sometimes it used to just grab things, and I was eating it before I even knew it. You might say, "Oh, you're a weird person." But yeah, what do we do about, since the system is going to take a while to change, but it takes only a millisecond to eat the wrong things. Yeah. What do we do to, oh, but you're preaching to the choir. Everybody here they know how to do this thing.
Well, no, we're creatures of habit, and there are systems, external and then even internal, right? We have brain paths. You know, I remember hearing somebody on Colbert years ago, it was like this brain expert was asked to describe brain function in 5 words. He said, nerve cells fire in patterns. So sometimes a pattern or a habit, you come home, go into the fridge, and grab what, right? And there's just patterns and habits that we as individuals have, and creating new patterns and habits that are healthy is key. And it's easier when there are people around you doing it. You know, and sometimes the big decision occurs when you're at the grocery store or farmer's market or wherever buying the food. And if you have healthy food in the house, you're gonna eat healthy food. But if you buy the junk food and put it in the house, you're gonna probably grab that, right? So it's knowing how to create a structure and a system around oneself that will lead to healthy patterns and habits. And the more that these are followed, it's kind of like, again, paths in the brain. The more you do something, the more locked in it becomes, for better or worse. So, and changing from one bad habit to another habit, you know, can take time. But systemically, you know, a big problem and a big challenge is that we have such bad food so widely accessible and affordable, and most people are eating it. So kind of being different in that normalized, unhealthy system is challenging, and it does often take a lot of discipline.
I mean, it's more than challenging. My friends I'm a snowflake now, barbecue is gonna be Brussels sprouts every time. And people saying, look, you keep on writing about this veggie stuff when you're not coming over to watch the any football games. We don't want you around, basically, is what they're saying. And it's like a whole social ostracizing. And you don't want to say, well, I'll just follow the crowd and do whatever everybody else does. But it's hard to be,
No, we are social animals, and I think we have some sort of genetic kind of predisposition to want to get along. You think about our ancestors, traveling in groups, and you wouldn't want to be left behind. So we have this, I think, long-standing desire to belong and be part of something. And food is a huge part of how we bond, right? We break bread, we gather around the table, it's about community. And now the vegan shows up, right? And this can be challenging. And oftentimes, it's not only challenging for the vegan, it can be challenging for the other people too, who say, what am I gonna make? And like I know when I go my girlfriend's sister, sometimes when we've gone there for Thanksgiving, she's just going, what am I gonna do? They just kind of freak out. So but food is very emotional, and being vegan in a non-vegan space can be very challenging for
all
people.
the jokes you hear about on the radio, esteemed people on NPR, I'll never eat that kind of thing.
Right. No, it's just, again, a normalized acceptance of things that should be critically evaluated. And if you think about human history, we have normalized a lot of really bad things that most people say is okay and normal, right? And then those that say that's not okay are the crazies, So this is, kind of the part of human evolution, right? It's just, I think, Einstein talked about, being challenged by just folks that don't think, really, and that's kind of what it is. It's really being critical thinkers and trying to act with some integrity and kindness and trying to live in a way that is healthy and doesn't cause unnecessary harm, and I think most people would agree with those basic principles. How do you do it becomes a little more challenging, and that's again the system stuff that's so hard.
You don't feel like you're in the army of the crazies?
I think that's why movies like The Game Changers are so important, right? When you have a new set of role models, or even some old role models like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's an amazing film, Game Changers. These are, again, elite athletes performing at the highest level, talking about plant eating as the way they do it. Because, the other thing is meat and power. There's a lot of other kind of sort of subconscious contexts there, too. Meat has historically been consumed by those with power who have the ability to exploit and appropriate resources. And so, and that's why most ethnic food that are eaten by most people tend to be more plant-based, because most people eat plants because it's more efficient. The elite, wealthy, powerful eat meat. So there's this whole other thing about it. And so the thing about Game Changers is you have these guys that are like, carrying more weight than anybody's ever carried, or NFL football players that are vegan. And it's like, kind of blows the whole notion of weakness and plants. It flips it, says plants and power kind of go together. Physical power, but there's other kinds of power too.
There was a study that came out very recently that tried to purport that eating red meat was actually good for you. I was surprised that there was some blowback on that, but still, I don't think most people heard the critique. They just heard the. What do you make of that?
Well, it's interesting. It's very interesting, and it's sort of an ongoing practice. And this was a scientist that had ties to the meat industry, who published research with a headline saying eating red meat's okay. And I think in the Game Changers, that is actually like an industry hack being kind of interviewed, and she's this central casting character. She's a mother. She's a nutritionist. And eating meat is okay, right? So there's this effort to really create these spokespeople, and that's why for so long industries try to get athletes to drink cow's milk. The whole milk mustache thing, for example, these are role models. But oftentimes scientists have actually, I think, been very much in cahoots with this industry, funded by this industry, and they're also probably believe it. You know, they're eating meat and they believe it. And you know, there's years ago, some doctors would talk about how smoking was actually good for you because it helped to reduce stress. But you know, at that time, a lot of doctors were smoking. So a lot of these scientists are eating meat. So there's this broad kind of belief system and prejudice that exists that doing this is healthy and good. And scientists are not immune from that. And when there's money involved, it's easy to kind of really look the other way. But it's part of this reductionist science that's been going on a long time, where you know, you do a study and you find this molecule in this mouse causes this benefit, and then you extrapolate it out to a headline: drinking cow's milk prevents cancer. And I've seen that happen. So this is not whole science. And I think when you look at epidemiology and you look at science more broadly, more holistically, as opposed to in a very reductionist, narrow-minded way, oftentimes intended to find a certain result, the evidence is clear that eating plants instead of animals is better for us. But this is part of what happens. And I think there's that film called Merchants of Doubt that talked about how the tobacco industry did this too, how when there was science talking about tobacco being harmful, they started creating these doubts. And some of you may recall that time in Washington where you had the CEOs or the head executives of all the tobacco industry in front of a congressional committee being asked one after the other, do you believe there's any science that shows that tobacco causes, you know, heart disease or whatever the issue was? And the science was clear. And one after another, they said, we do not believe that. There is no science that shows that. So it's amazing the extent to which we are able to delude ourselves into believing things that make us feel good about what we're doing, that, you know, it's good for our bank account. And that is the industry we're up against. You know, whether it's the pharmaceutical, who are saving people, you know, feeding, or farmers feeding the world, or politicians, you know, who might get into all this too. So it's really about, again, belief systems as much as it is about infrastructures and socio-economic systems.
We're approaching an hour, and I would like to leave some time for you all to ask questions. So let me bring it back to the farm sanctuary. I never heard of anybody rescuing cows and sheep and, you know, finding homes for them. What has that been like for you? You have a favorite animal?
You know, when we started doing this, we didn't really have that as a vision of like doing these sanctuaries, rescuing a lot of animals. We would literally find animals left for dead, and you can't leave them on a dead pile, so you take care of them. So we now have sanctuaries in New York, in California, and you know, I'm not on the farm on a regular basis now. I'm actually spending more time on the farm lately, which is really great. But back when I was on the farm, you know, you would get to know individuals, and you know, Opie was one of my good buddies. He was a calf that was born as a male on a dairy farm, and he was sent to the stockyard on the day he was born because he was a male, and dairy farms don't really want the males, and the auction was probably happening that day, so sent him off, and he was still wet from afterbirth, and he ended up becoming down and was dying of hypothermia, and he came to us and lived with us for nearly 20 years. And he's this beautiful 3,000-pound dude, you know, so it was, but the sanctuary is a place where the animals are our friends, not our food. It's a place where people can connect with other animals that they don't often get a chance to connect with, other than as a piece of meat on the plate, right? And so we want to create this new experience and see that these animals are living, feeling creatures, not too different than your cats and dogs. And there are now hundreds of sanctuaries around the world. I was just in Portugal. I stayed at a sanctuary there where they also grow food and they do hospitality stuff. They have like Airbnb and things they do there. So the sanctuary movement, I think, is evolving, in addition to rescuing animals, working to create experiences that inspire vegan living. Because even if we rescued 1 million animals a year, which would be really hard to do, it would be a drop in the bucket. Millions of animals are killed every day, billions every year, and trillions if you include fish. So it's this massive industry. So the only way to ultimately address it is changing how we eat. And sanctuaries play an important role in modeling, again, relationships where animals are our friends. And I think sometimes people have epiphanies when they visit. So that's important. And then those people who visit can hopefully go home and tell their stories, which then rubs off on others. You know, we're social animals, and I think sanctuaries also have played a role historically and will continue doing so in empowering and inspiring and supporting activists and advocates. It's kind of a sanctuary for animals and a sanctuary for people. You know, we started in 86 and saw a lot of really horrible things at factory farms. Rescuing animals kind of helped heal us. You know, the sanctuary still kind of played that role as a healing place for all of us who care about these issues.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, so if you haven't been to Watkins Glen, they have a hoedown every year. I was able to go up this August with my sister, and it's a beautiful place, and get to wander out in the fields with the cows and going. And we had this one experience there. There was a barn, and there must have been like 50 sheep in there, and people were petting the sheep, and it was like somebody snapped their fingers, and all of a sudden all the sheep started just hauling ass out of the barn and rounded the corner, and everybody's standing there like, where did they go? Where did they go? And it wasn't dinner time or anything. And about 2 minutes later, all the sheep came running back in and dispersed around the barn. So it was a really cool experience.
And they're social animals too, right? One does, and they.
While we're doing that, I'm going to tee up the first question. I think one of the things that I've read recently is that there are more vegans and vegetarians from 12 to 22 as there are from 22 up, which is a really cool thing because it makes it feel like there's a hump that's coming along. And as people look at, businesses look at that data and they start to prepare for what the future is going to be, the spending dollars as those kids get jobs and they complete education. And at the same time, you have people without, the outcome-based medicine, when you actually change somebody that's really sick onto a plant-based diet, they become more convinced, I think, than people that are doing it for health and for animal and environmental reasons. So you have sort of these two populations coming together. And my question, I guess, is to Jean about your optimism for the future. You know, do you feel like the pace of change is increasing, decreasing, status quo? What are you seeing from where you are?
I think it's really increasing, and I think that access to information on the internet, people sharing not only images of the cruelty, but also recipes for vegan food, or information about where you can go get a good vegan meal in a particular area. So I think it's getting much easier, and then, as I mentioned before, there's all this investment now from big business starting to move in the space, which I think will only help to accelerate it. And the fact is, with the growing human population, we don't have enough resources to feed everybody meat the way we've been doing it. So we kind of have to change. So it's a lot of things moving us in this direction.
It feels like things are coming to ahead. Would anybody like to ask either Courtland or Jean a question? The first is always a...
Sure, I'll jump in. Sorry, me first.
Jean, I don't know if you can answer this, but I was contemplating getting a flu shot, and there's some relation with eggs with flu shots. Are you able to explain that so I can understand if that's vegan or not?
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer to that. I've not gotten a flu shot for a long time. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but unfortunately I don't have a lot of information. You know much about that flu shot stuff?
Yeah, I do, but I won't say it right now. Columnists know everything. We'll put it in the paper and hope you believe it. But Gwen probably knows.
About flu shots?
I'm probably not going to voice an opinion on that. It would be
We just play
opinion. I think
doctors.
I always turn it back to the doctors. I tend to avoid doctors if I can. I'll tell you, I've been down in Norfolk the past week with my dad's got pneumonia, and he and my mother had pneumonia vaccines about 2 months ago. So it's one of those things, if you get it and you don't get a flu, then you think maybe you're ahead. But it's like you can get a vaccine against elephants too, and if the elephants never show up, was it the vaccine or was it just there weren't any elephants? And I think the better precaution is to eat a really healthy diet and exercise and get a lot of sleep. and do everything that you can do that way.
So this is for Courtland. I just wanted to offer something to you in your battle against the eggnog. What I'm about to share with you, you will no doubt consider me extraordinarily rude and vulgar. However, I actually will be the best friend you've ever had, because I wish somebody said to me 40 years ago, somebody had the guts to say to me what I'm about to say to them. If you want to keep away from things that you know are bad for you, it matters what you see in the mirror every morning when you look at that face. And I can tell you this. Right now, I'm inviting everybody in this restaurant to come with me on Saturday for a great event. It's called the Kick a Chipmunk Run. We go out for a run, we find a chipmunk, we kick it up against a tree, and we watch it gasping in pain. And we kick it again, we laugh, we celebrate. It's a hell of a lot of fun. You guys should all be there. Try it. Now you're probably all a little bit shocked. What if you saw somebody doing that? What if it was like a 10-year-old kid who you could easily just push away? Say, hey, don't do that. What are you doing? What's the matter with you? That's what you're doing by buying eggnog. That's what you're doing by having a hamburger. That's what you're doing by having chicken wings. Now you can't even envision kicking a chipmunk because it hasn't been normalized. All those other things have been normalized. They are just as bad. And that does not make you a man. That makes you a coward. And that's where the fight is. Because the meat industry wants you to think that killing animals that are defenseless and innocent makes you a real man. And really, you're just a coward. So think about that next time you're reaching for something that you know you shouldn't.
All right.
The plant-based eggnogs are pretty good too.
What is pretty good?
I said the plant-based eggnogs are.
Oh, okay. Keep inflaming these things. There's a question up there.
There is a book that Dr. Neil Barnard wrote that's right behind you. You can pull up, called The Cheese Trap. If you haven't read that, I'll send a copy home with you tonight. But it's a great book. Was there a question up here?
Yeah, I'm from upstate New York, and I used to work on a dairy farm when I was in high school, and it's tough for the farmers too. They work really long days, and I think to a certain extent they feel trapped as well with debt and everything. And I was wondering if you had any examples from up there where you help people transition from dairy farming to something else, and does your organization assist with that?
That is something we're just starting to look at, and I would love nothing more than for us to do that. And I was actually talking to somebody the other day who is a farmer from that area about that exact issue. He knows a couple of dairies in his area that are struggling, going out of business, and I said, let's talk, And there's a guy at Cornell that I've spoken with who works with distressed dairy farmers trying to find alternatives. Because it's very tough. I mean, a lot of these folks, like you say, feel trapped. It's what they know. And we need to figure out how to help get them new opportunities. And so it's something I want us to do more. We're starting to explore it, but there's enormous potential. And there's a lot of these dairies that are going out of business, small dairies. And we need to find alternatives. And there's a guy I know up there who's an organic farmer. He just built a facility to process grain, so he might be an ally. Also, there are now produce auctions in the Finger Lakes region where they sell, produce, and a lot of these are former dairy farmers growing produce. So that's starting to happen, but I think there's more we can do to support it.
I found a story from Finland, and it began, Finland didn't like the rate of deaths from cardiovascular disease, and in the early 70s started a government program to get healthier by reducing cholesterol, hypertension, and smoking. If you kind of look that story up, you'll find that what they did for the dairy farmers was to help them transition to fruits, nuts, other items that were unique to Finland. So it's possible.
And those can be great
It's
examples.
always based on consumer demand. I think in the film Plant Pure Nation, there was a pickle farmer that had turned into a dairy farmer, and they went back to pickle farming after they felt like consumer demand was starting to change. So it's hopefully going to be a transitional thing and not
And government programs should incentivize transitions instead of incentivizing maintaining the very unhealthy, difficult status quo, right? So that's where, like, again, a lot of these dairy farmers, they get a monthly check if they do a certain thing that they've always been done, they've known. So it's hard then to take a big leap of faith without knowing that there's some support or some opportunity in front of you. So, but when one does it and somebody else says, well, that worked for them, then others are likely to do it. So creating those positive examples, I think, is very important. And upstate New York is New York used to be the #1 dairy state in the U.S. And then it was passed by Wisconsin, and then Wisconsin was passed by California. So New York's now the #3 dairy state. But in all places, smaller dairies are being replaced by big dairies. And so those small dairies are folks that could be really strong allies at some point if we can provide opportunities.
I appreciate, by the way, the appeal to morality on this.
And frankly, man, as a man, we are told from a very young age to protect what needs to be protected. Watch over your little brother going to school. Watch over them, protect them. Well, then we should protect, should we not? Should we not?
Well, yeah, the morality. I mean, I'm looking at what happened in the Amazon when people's financial interests, whether it's here in this country, well, maybe it's our appetite here, but it was definitely financial interest that made people just say, let's burn this down. You know, thousands of fires in an area where we know, or we should know, directly affects the health of the entire planet. And yet,
there are so many anti-heroes and evil people in the world. I don't have to tell you that. As Gene said, it's always about money, right? It's always about money. But the money can be made other ways. And we have to take a stand and say, not on my watch. Not on my watch. We are going to protect the planet. We will protect our families by not filling them with disease-filled chemicals, crap, pus, mucus, and blood, as Gene said. And we'll protect ourselves. We'll be man enough to protect ourselves and step up. But that's not rhetoric that we hear a lot about, but that is the truth, and that will resonate, that people see it as what it really is. Don't be a coward, be a real man.
what do you think of that approach?
Well, I think that, one of the things we say at Farm Sanctions is speak to people where they are on their own journeys. We sort of assume that most people want to be humane and don't want to cause unnecessary harm, and that they're sort of engaged in habits and practices that are not aligned with their own values. So then it's a matter of how do we reach people, and different people will respond to different messages. I think and I also think that if somebody goes vegan for health reasons, they're also much more receptive to the ethical issues because they're not now sort of feeling like they're being criticized for being inhumane, right? So human beings are complicated, emotional creatures, and I think we can be creatures of conscience, where we see something wrong and say, I'm not going to do that, and I think that's important to do. And I also think that there are systems and diversions and stories we tell ourselves to make bad things okay. And that's the delusions, I guess, was the other word I was looking at. And so we have to try to, I think, ultimately empower people to live with kindness, but each person has to make their own choices and be responsible for their own choices. So this is where it's complicated, because each person does have to stand for something, do their thing, and believe in something and live according to it. But even as a vegan, I fly in airplanes, which isn't perfect, right? So there are things that I do that are compromises in a sense, and it's just a matter of accepting what those are. Even eating fruits and vegetables, oftentimes these might be picked by people in the field who are not necessarily treated very well, right? So this is, again, kind of an ethical kind of dilemma. Compromise, I guess I would say. I mean, I try to buy organic, try to buy local, all that, but in each choice we make, there are going to be implications, and you do the best you can while recognizing it's not going to be perfect. Now, when it comes to eating animals, we can do very well without eating animals. That's, for me, very easy. But there's a lot of other sort of related matters when you talk about ethics broadly, about not harming animals, not harming workers, not destroying the Amazon, not hurting your family, and who are eating food that's making them sick. So, I think the ethics are important, and I also think human beings are complicated, and change happens over time.
Can I add to that, Jean? So I think in my journey, I stopped eating animals because I loved animals early on, and I remember stopping eating cows in my teens and poultry in my 20s, and I finally gave up fish, I think, in my 30s. So I think there are very few people that were actually born and raised as vegans. It's something that sort of gets normalized, and then people discover on their own. And as I moved down this path, one of the things that I found was that Jean's philosophy of meeting people where they are, being kind to other people as you would be kind to other animals, so the non-human animals and the human animals, being kind to everyone is the most important thing that you can do. And when I went to the HSUS has something called Take Action for Animals every year. If you haven't gone to that, they talk about how to engage with lobbyists and policymakers. And as a result of that, now I work with both Jennifer Boysko as our state senator and Ken Plum, our congressman, and both of them are signed up for animal-friendly legislation, which means at any time that they have new legislation that's for the benefit of animals, that they're committed to signing it. But that in that forum that I attended, they said that 65% of people are going to become plant-based or vegan because of selfish reasons, that it's good for their own health. And I'm a data person. I spent a lot of time in the IT industry, and I look at the statistics, and it's like, okay, you can maybe not like that. It's usually 2 to 3% are going to come for ethical reasons. And if you try to push that, then you're going to get 2 to 3% of the people. But if you come from the health perspective, and you can get somebody to feel better, look better, think clear, sleep better, and be a role model to their friends, outperform from an athletic perspective, then you're going to convince a lot more people, because people are going to say, what have you changed? What are you doing differently? And they're going to be attracted to that person who's kind and not pushing necessarily a message, but they've adapted their own set of beliefs that is helping them through health issues. And I can tell you from a health perspective, the outcome-based power of eating organic, plant-based, and SOS-free, not just a vegan diet, but those 3 things that we do here, it amazes me sometimes how quickly the human body responds to that. And we've had people that have been vegan that have gone through our program, and still we see the same 20 to 30% cholesterol drop, or we see the same people that are trying to lose weight. But heart disease, now I think that with the industry recognizing that vegan is an industry, that you have vegans with heart disease, and vegans with type 2 diabetes, and vegans with cancer. And so it's all of those things are because people did it for ethical reasons and not for health, the health benefits. And when they come from a health perspective, then it's going to be sustaining, and it's more easily defensible with their friends, because they can say, I'm doing this for my health. And then other people see that you're trim, you're in shape, for your age you look great, you have good skin, and you're going to be that role model for other people. So, for me, that was sort of the path that I sort of adapted with Green Fair, not being a vegan restaurant, but being a restaurant focused on health. And so it's inspired a lot of choices here. Maybe back to your point, when I first was planning to open, I interviewed and some of you, I apologize if you've heard these stories, but other restaurant owners advised me, have your liquor license available on day one, because that's where you're going to make your profit. And so I went out and I got an ABC license, and we had a vegan and organic wine and beer. And when I was out at McDougall's clinic, he said, he kind of made the toss-away comment, well, alcohol is a known carcinogen. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, well, we're the healthy planet, the healthy people, healthy planet. How does that fit with the brand? And so we decided not to sell it, but to allow people to bring it in. So it's always these dilemmas, and I think you know, it's to Jean's point and Courtland's point and Evan's point, I think it's just being conscious of what you're doing, what your impact on the world is as you go through. It's trying to minimize your footprint and being kind to other people and being an example that, you know, the way that you're living life is an example to other people. I spent 35 years in the intelligence community, and so my whole modus operandi there was to stay below the radar screen and not to be in the newspaper and not to be telling people about things that we were doing, but maintain a low profile. Success is where nothing happens when you're in that space. And since we've had Green Fair, we've had maybe 36 senior executives in the intelligence community are now plant-based. 2 directors from the National Reconnaissance Office, the CIA, CIO. So a lot of people that I've been able to influence because they see me and I'm coming at it from a health perspective, and they want to have that same health and awareness and that education. And so it's really from that perspective that I'm trying to lead Green Fair in the way to influence as many people as possible. The Game Changers film, is part of the financing for that to help get that, because I think film is such an important way to create new role models. And what I loved about that film was they did it solely on health, and they talked about environment. And I think, it's always, I think for me, that it's the outcome that you want to have happen. And for me, I love animals more than anything. I love the environment, but I know the approach from a health perspective is what's going to be the most effective from a point of leverage. So I just wanted to share that. Anyone else want to, Marcia?
Just really quickly, I wanted to give Courtland another reason not to drink milk.
I'm taping all of this.
I'm not a doctor, but I read the China study by T. Colin Campbell, and he talks in that about the experiments on cancer and casein, the milk protein, and how it can turn on and off cancer growth.
Milk.
Milk.
Yes.
Yeah, the
Which
protein in
has,
milk.
it's in eggnog, isn't it?
Unless it's so quick, you did non-dairy eggnog, yeah.
I'm from Louisiana originally. Buckle of the Bible Belt, evangelical type, advocacy, and people really do respond to the hellfire and brimstone stuff. We really care about life before it gets here, and then after it comes, people really don't care that much about whether you're healthy or not. My dad is going to get his driver's license renewed at age 100, and he'll still be eligible to get a gun. And Louisiana has the highest rate of car wreck fatalities and gun deaths and stuff like that. So I wonder sometimes about health. How do you get people who really don't care that much about how their health, whether you can browbeat them morally into I don't know, maybe you can. If people really don't.
There's a percentage of the population that is going to care about their health, and you can't save everybody. That's sort of what I've come to believe. And I think all of us, Jean and I have had discussions before about even in our own families, it's really tough. I think my brother and his wife are very strong plant-based now from coming in here and reading the data. Different things resonate with different people. To Evan's point, I watched the videos early in my career. I'd see some animal being abused. It's like, I'm never going to eat that again, right? I'm one of those Lope and Jean, so those things are going to work for some people. But we all struggle with people that we love and that we're close to, you're not going to convince them by browbeating them into doing one thing or another. I think you have to meet everybody where they are. And my dad, I think, was very reluctant to make changes
But when I go away from being with him, he goes out and he tells everybody else all the benefits of plant-based eating. And he's become the biggest expert now and talking about it. Go to my daughter's website or watch this movie. And I went down there, and him and my mom are drinking soy milk now. So it's pretty, it's pretty cool. It's like they're on their journey and they're moving forward. So it's.
I've had a similar thing with my folks. When we first started Farm Sanctuary, said, "You got a college degree and you're cleaning up poop in a barn? What's that?" And, and then my dad had a heart attack about 15, 20 years ago, and they're in the hospital. They're feeding him bacon and eggs, and it kind of got his attention. And then he read Dean Ornish's book about reversing heart disease, and then he was vegetarian for a while, but it didn't stick. But he's eating less meat, and they have soy milk in their refrigerator. My folks do. So it is a process, and sometimes when people are struck with a tragedy or a very, impactful experience where they're really at the end of their kind of rope, that's when big change can happen. But when people are just hanging in there and kind of doing okay, and everybody else is on heart medication too, then sometimes there doesn't seem like a compelling reason to change, right? It's like, well, everybody's like this, but then if you have the vegans come through and are this happy, healthy group, and they see that, then a new reality becomes possible. Sometimes people only know what they know, and if all they know is that you go on heart medication in your 50s and you die of heart attack in your 70s, then that's all they know. But if people start seeing that there's other ways to be, then I think leading by example is critical, because we really do learn from those around us, whether or not we're even conscious of it.
One thing sort of begats something else too. I think once you start changing your diet for health, and if you become more open and start reading more things, and I think things like leather car seats, clothing, those are sort of the next things that people start taking a look at. I've got these really cute vegan shoes that I got, but it's one of those things that as you get on this path that you start, it makes you conscious of a lot of other things that you hadn't been aware of, but it does, when you feel better, then you really start, I think, taking a look at other things. So,
and I think feeling better is like health and well-being. And in some cases, people are in such a state that they may not really be in a position to really think broadly. They're just trying to survive and just trying to, day by day, and oh, that's too much time, I can't think about that, right? This sort of mindset of like feeling unable to change, disempowered really. So I think a big part of our work is to empower people and to inspire people and give people the tools to start going in this direction, systemically. But sometimes people who feel like they're doing a bad thing, they feel like they're causing harm, just sometimes don't want to see it. And like dairy farmers that I've spoken to, sometimes probably feel like they're not doing a great thing, and then the vegan comes along and says, "You're not doing a great thing," they will sometimes just totally dig in. So there's that whole emotional reaction. And sometimes people even, I think, have done things even worse to kind of make it sound like, or to validate in their own minds that these animals don't matter. You tell them they matter, they don't matter, and then they'll even do something worse to kind of make the point that they don't matter. So people's psychology is really a tricky thing, and creating health and wholeness and healing is ultimately, I think, what it's about. And I think that people who are working in slaughterhouses, people who are doing all these horrible things, in many cases don't want to be doing it, and would rather not be doing it, but don't know how to get out, and they believe they have to do it. So this is, again, part of this whole system that we're in, and creating the opportunities out is, I think, where a lot of potential now exists.
I've been doing interviews in Southeast Washington where there, for maybe 250,000 people, there are 3 grocery stores, and one is just a kind of almost like a dollar store type grocery store. But they're trying to make the corner stores bring in healthy foods from the DC kitchen, vegetables and things like that. But some of them aren't doing very well because people are feeling really pinched. They're feeling really stressed, and they want to eat the stuff that makes them feel good, and they want it. And these are some single mothers who don't have time to do a lot of cooking, no time to prepare. That survival mode is a heck of a thing. And when I would bring up the question of, wouldn't you like to have tomatoes and potatoes and stuff like that? And they would, theoretically, you know, but there's a reality at which you gotta be kidding me. You know, I'm grabbing this snack for the kid, you know, hoping this bag of chips and these Twinkies fill them up, and I'm grabbing a soda, and we're off to the races. Which brings back to the capitalism and how it doesn't affect just the dairy people and the farmers and stuff, but there's a level in our society at which, you know, people, the food insecurity is phenomenal in the nation's capital. You know, people are just going hungry. But anyway, I'm just saying.
Yeah, that's part of the whole system, you know, and, you know, I dream about the idea that, like, there would be more urban farming, urban gardening, you know, and there's a little bit of this starting to happen, and there's this one guy I know who teaches in the Bronx, New York, and he started a group called Green Bronx Machine, and, you know, a lot of his kids are from tough backgrounds, and they have, you know, homeless and whatnot, and have like 40% attendance rate in the school, and the kids really had no hope or desire to go to school. So then he started teaching them to grow plants and to grow food. It's got over 90% attendance rate now. And so these kids are starting to eat better food, they're starting to feel good about themselves, and now some of these kids are becoming entrepreneurs and doing gardens in the Hamptons, you know? So it's like creating these opportunities for people, because, so it's, again, leading by example and having a few individuals do this, then other people see it, and then they start doing it. But if you don't see anybody ever do that, then it's not even a thought, it's a possibility. So I think, you know, these examples are so important.
One kid could not recognize a tomato because they'd only seen it between two buns, you know, just a slice smothered with cheese. Anyway.
Yeah, no, food literacy. Yeah. You know, people really don't know in many cases.
So I want to thank Courtland for the, I think, about half a dozen articles that he's been writing in the Post on plant-based nutrition. And I want to thank Jean for the hard work that you're doing for decades with Farm Sanctuary.
And we want to thank you, Gwen.
Yes, absolutely.
We have a few copies of Jean's book if anybody wants to take a look at that. I appreciate everybody coming tonight, and hope you had enjoyed the dinner and had a good time. Thank you.
Yes, thanks everybody.
Thank you.